Britain's War Against the Slave Trade is a 2021 work of maritime history by the English author Anthony Sullivan. It's one of several works on the topic, beginning with Christopher Lloyd's The Navy and the Slave Trade in 1949, which have appeared in recent years yet made few inroads into public awareness. This remains a neglected part of British history. The story begins in 1807 with the abolition by the British Parliament of its slave trade. Some of the myths are still worth addressing. Slave trading wasn't a European invention, nor did Europeans have a monopoly on appalling cruelty. Conditions aboard Middle Eastern dhows carrying slaves across the Indian Ocean, continuous for at least a millennium before the Portuguese arrived on the scene, were equally horrendous. And of course, not only did Africa have homegrown slavery, but African monarchs often consolidated their power by cooperating with foreign slavers. In the context of that, the abolition of slavery should arguably be seen as far from inevitable, and not something that left alone would eventually just have withered away. The proof of that is that, according to Anti-Slavery International, there are still 50 million slaves in the world today. Nevertheless, it's rare to encounter outrage or even widespread concern at that fact. The truth may be that humans generally have a nasty tendency to get used to even the worst things, often made easier by living well apart from the scene of the crime. In 1808, the British Admiralty created the West African Squadron, a small fleet of battleships whose purpose was to turn what could have been a merely formal declaration of cessation of trade into something proactive, something with teeth. The aim was to stop British merchant ships engaging in what was still a potentially very profitable business. The first question a lot of modern historians often ask is, were those battleships too few? Were they up to the job? Those are evaluative questions. However, it needs to be remembered that Britain was at war with France at the time. Britain gradually pressured other European countries to stop slaving and to sign treaties to that effect, which would give the Royal Navy access to their vessels. So the second question is, did they do that from ulterior motives? Early on, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish and the Americans claimed that Britain simply wanted to stop others profiting from the slave trade. Some modern historians are always sceptical of British establishment motives, so they tend to concur. But they often also want to claim that Britain committed too few ships of too inferior a quality. It's difficult to reconcile those two claims. The third question is, when did the Royal Navy's campaign against slavery end? In 2007, Bernard Edwards convincingly argued for 1898, about 30 years after most other authors. Whether that works may depend on whether the title of your book is The Royal Navy's Battle Against the Transatlantic Slave Trade, or whether it's a more inclusive The Transoceanic Slave Trade. Edwards included Arab-sponsored slaving from Tanzania. Since the Royal Navy vigorously and effectively opposed that too, his move seems justifiable. Everyone agrees that the West Africa Squadron was badly equipped, and yet that its personnel seemed to take their duties extremely seriously. They frequently ran down much larger, better armed ships. Captured vessels were taken to Sierra Leone, a country founded by British abolitionists at the end of the 18th century, to provide a safe haven for emancipated slaves. They were then either demolished or sold at auction. The traders were tried before a vice-admiralty court. The slaves, of course, were freed. There were numerous David and Goliath stories, many worthy of authors like C.S. Forrester or Patrick O'Brien. Anthony Sullivan's account of the meeting between HMS Hope and the Brazilian slaver Príncipe de Guinea in 1826 isn't unrepresentative. By the 2nd of August, HMS Hope had carried out more than 24 boardings, but had made no arrests. However, returning to the African coast, she found the Brazilian brig Príncipe de Guinea preparing to load slaves. With a crew of 72 and armed with a traversing 24-pounder long gun, 4 9-pounders, 2 6-pounders and 2 swivels, the newly launched 280-ton brig was regarded as one of the fastest slavers on the coast. Just a few days earlier, she'd been stopped and boarded by HMS Esk, whilst empty, and her crew had boasted that no cruiser would ever catch her with slaves. Learning from a merchantman that Prince Guinea was shortly expected to complete her loading, Lieutenant Tucker began cruising across her expected track, and early on the 5th of August spotted her putting to sea. Following a chase lasting 28 hours, HMS Hope came up with her the following morning, and Tucker fired several shots across her bows to bring her to. Prince Guinea returned fire, beginning an action lasting 2 hours and 40 minutes, the last hour of which was spent at close quarters. With 3 of his guns out of action, Tucker, faint from the loss of blood caused by a wound to his foot, finally managed to run his bowsprit across Prince Guinea's quarter. The brig was quickly secured for the loss of just 3 British sailors wounded, to Prince Guinea's 11 killed and 15 wounded. 590 slaves were discovered on board the prize. 2 had been killed during the action, a further 12 wounded, and 16 others had drowned attempting to swim across to HMS Hope. Prince Guinea was condemned by the Anglo-Portuguese court on the 2nd of September, 579 slaves surviving to be emancipated, including 1 newborn baby. The final question is, how effective was the Royal Navy's anti-slavery campaign? What were its long-term achievements, if any? In his 2012 Freedom Burning, the Durham University professor Richard Hussey argued that after Britain abolished slavery, Victorians adopted a creed of anti-slavery as a vital part of their national identity and moral superiority. This enabled them, he thinks, to become more sophisticated imperialists and even racists. In her 2011 The Slave Trade and the Origins of International Human Rights Law, Jenny Martinez, the current provost of Stanford University, argued that the origins of modern human rights law lie not primarily in the Enlightenment, as is often supposed, but in the international admiralty courts that tried captured slave crews. On both those scholars' assessments, the Royal Navy's campaign was integral to something much bigger, with a much more profound legacy than is often supposed. Anthony Sullivan thinks there's little evidence that the Navy's campaign was anything other than a moral crusade, run with seemingly little enthusiasm by the Admiralty. By its termination, it had cost Britain around £2 billion in today's money, and the lives of around 2,000 seamen, one of the country's most valuable assets. Was it a case of too little, too late, as some people would like to say, or was it a case of better late than never, as others would insist? Or was it something even more than that? This whole topic is far more complex than I've had time to show here. Alongside Sullivan, a very good place to start is Sian Rees's 2009 Sweetwater and Bitter, the ships that stopped the slave trade. But that's enough for one day.